Here's a synopsis, Richard, of a lot of similar questions that bring us to your book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. A viewer who identifies himself as a longtime fan of Dr. Wolf writes, "You're passionate about worker self-directed enterprises. Can you explain briefly why you think these are the way to save capitalism? Critics say your alternative may work in theory, but not in practice."
My point is that workers ought to be, all of us who work in an office, a factory, or a store, ought to be in the position of participating in the decisions governing that enterprise. And I do that not only because I believe in democracy. And let me say that if you do believe in democracy, it's always been a mystery to me why that democracy that you believe in doesn't apply to the place where you work. After all, 5 out of 7 days of every week, most of your adult life, you're at work. So if democracy is an important value, it ought to be at your job because that's where you are most of the time. And democracy at the job means the following. If you have to live with the decisions that are made in a job, what you're producing, what technology is being used, what the health conditions of your workplace are, what's done with the fruits of your labor, literally whether your factory or your office continues, since you have to live with those decisions, you ought to participate, the basic idea of democracy. So I like the idea of cooperative enterprises because it fulfills my value commitment to democracy, whereas a capitalist enterprise doesn't, because it keeps all the decision-making in a tiny minority. We all who go to work have to live with their decisions, but we don't participate in them, not even to speak of the community that has to live with the decisions. But the second reason is I see concrete results coming from an enterprise that was run by the workers collectively, and let me give you a few examples. First, do most of us believe that if the workers themselves made a decision that they would close the enterprise and move it to China? I don't think so. I think that the whole running away of enterprises out of the United States was made possible because the decisions to close enterprises here and to open them in another part of the world where you could get away with paying workers much less was a decision that was very good for the folks who make the decisions, but not for the average workers there. So if we had decision-making made by the workers in place, they wouldn't undo their own jobs and they wouldn't move, and that would make a very different economic system from the one we have today. Second example, although I can give you many, Bill, if you want them. When it comes to deciding what to do with the profits, suppose instead the workers themselves made that decision democratically. How do we divide the profits? You think they would give a handful of top officials wild sums of money to buy $40 million apartments on Fifth Avenue while everybody else was having to borrow money to get their kids through school? I don't think so. I think the people collectively would distribute the wealth, more to some than others for all kinds of reasons, but they would do it in a much less unequal way than we have in a capitalist system. So I challenge all of those who are concerned with a more equal system, with less inequality, to come up with a better way of achieving it than having workers be in a position to make the decisions as to how we divide the profits, because that is the single most important determinant of the inequality of income in our society.
But how do you answer this viewer? In 1994, when United Airlines was on the brink of financial collapse, a deal was made creating the biggest employee-owned companies in the U.S. In 2002, the airline filed for bankruptcy.
My answer is the following. It's very important. For workers to own something is one thing. For workers to become the directors of their own enterprise is something else. Worker ownership means, for example, and we have lots of examples, both in the United States and around the world, that the workers become, in a sense, shareholders. They are the technical owners. But if the workers who become owners, and I'm not against that, but if the workers who become owners don't change the way the enterprise is operated, it remains a capitalist enterprise. It still has a board of directors, a handful of people who make all the decisions. It's true that the workers may vote for who those people are, but they've left the structure of the enterprise in the old form, hierarchical, top-down. That's what was done in United Airlines. I was involved in that. I actually know.
How so?
They called me in at a couple points to participate in some of the discussions. The International Associations of Machinists, which was the union that was part of that. So they left the old capitalist structure. They weren't willing to go beyond saying, we the workers become owners, but we leave the running of the enterprise, the directing of it, the day-to-day decisions in the old form made by the old experts. Part of a movement away from capitalism to a cooperative enterprise requires that the people of the United States stop believing that the folks at the top have some magical entitlement to give them that position. And I think that there has to be a change. I think most Americans have to recognize that the folks who run our enterprises, they had to learn how to do that. And we can all learn how to do that. It's the old argument, in a sense, that comes out of our history.
Here's a viewer named Jeff chiming in. Dr. Wolf, can you please give a concrete, not academic or theoretical explanation of how you would apply your employee-run business model to a McDonald's, Walmart, a hospital, or J.P. Morgan Chase?
Well, the answer is best given not as a hypothetical, but to describe an enterprise which is large, like all of those are, which has done this.
There is a film called Shift Change about the cooperative efforts, and we'll provide a link to that.
Well, the example I'm going to give is a company in Spain. It's called Mondragon, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. And a little history may interest folks. It was started in the middle of the 1950s by a Catholic priest in the north of Spain, in the Basque area, just south of the Pyrenees Mountains. It was a time of terrible privation in Spain after the World War II and the Spanish Civil War. There was terrible unemployment in this area, and the Catholic priest decided that one way to deal with unemployment was not to wait for a capitalist employer to come in and hire people, but to set up cooperatives. And he began with 6 parishioners in his Roman Catholic Church to start a co-op. Okay, this is 1956. Let's fast forward to 2013. That corporation now has over 100,000 employees. It has been a success story of gargantuan proportions. It is a family of co-ops within this large corporation. In most of these co-ops, the workers make the decisions of how this cooperative works. So let me give you an idea of how successful they've been. They partner with Microsoft and General Motors in their research labs because Microsoft and General Motors want to tap into their creative way of running a business. They have a rule that nobody can get more than 6 times what the lowest paid worker in an enterprise gets. The typical situation in a major American corporation is that the top executives gets 300 or 400 times what the lowest paid worker does. So they have solved the equality problem in a dramatic way for 120 roughly 1,000 people. There's a concrete example of how you can make a cooperative, democratically run enterprise successful, growing, and becoming a powerful community force. There is a Arizmendi, the name of that priest in Spain. There's the Arizmendi bakeries, 6 of them in the Bay Area, that are all run as cooperatives. And they run it as a worker-directed enterprise. They've been very successful. Their commitment, number one, is not profit. Their commitment, number one, is not growth. Their commitment, number one, is to their people.
Which brings me to a question from another viewer. How do you move to this alternative you're talking about and writing about without strong unions? Union membership is down to its lowest level since 1936 when Franklin Roosevelt was president. And can you do this without increased strength among unions?
A union, in its negotiations with an employer, currently is limited, in most cases, to asking for better wages, better working conditions. Imagine with me for a moment what it would mean if the unions developed a new strategy. Let's call it a 2-track strategy. On the one hand, you continue bargaining with your workers for better conditions from your employer. But on the other hand, you do something else. You begin to train workers to become able to run their own enterprises and to have a whole new bargaining chip when you confront an employer. Many unions over the last 30 years have been confronted by a company that basically comes and says the following. We're thinking of leaving Cincinnati, Sheboygan, Detroit, whatever. We need to get some concessions from you. We won't leave if you give us wage give-backs, lower benefits, all the usual things, or else we'll leave. The union doesn't know what to do, is terrified, doesn't want to call the bluff because it's not sure it is a bluff, etc., etc. So eventually the union caves. That has been the history over and over again. Imagine a union that had been able to say to these folks, okay, if you leave, rather than coming to a reasonable accommodation with us, we are going to set up an enterprise right here. The factory you leave, we will occupy. The jobs you don't pay us to do, we will do for ourselves. And you will be located in China, bringing goods back here, but we'll continue to produce goods here, and let's see which goods the American working people will buy.
But they will need capital to do that.
Yes. And the question is, where would the capital come from? And
the question is, where will the capital come from?
Good. The answer to where the capital come from, there are several possibilities. The first possibility is the United States government. The United States government has the money, needs to do something for our unemployment problem, and here's a way to do it. Because as the Marcora law in Italy that I mentioned earlier illustrates, there's a governmental and a social interest in doing this. This is a better way to solve the unemployment problem than giving people a dole for months or years at a time, during which time they lose their job connections, they often lose their skills. This is a much better solution, giving them the startup money to begin small, medium-sized enterprises that they will have a great interest in making successful because it's their future, it's their well-being that's at stake, and it's their collectively owned and operated enterprise. Well, why in the world don't we have a cooperative business administration, providing startup money and technical help so that these kinds of enterprise, particularly helping unemployed people, could begin not only to help them and to help our economy, but again, to provide that freedom of choice for Americans so we can all see how these enterprises work and make a collective decision whether we'd rather have an economy more of them than of the old capitalist type. And again, I think that the capitalists would be surprised by how many of us would choose that other route, and that would be a way to get it going.